inspiration for Armageddon was predictably Revelations, the last book of the Holy Bible. After a short, intensive reading, I had the image of a triangle firmly fixed in my mind. I wanted 7 triangles representing the 7 ancient churches of the world, so I played with various configurations. The configuration I decided on I called precarious, for obvious reasons. Next, I drew a convenient circle, joining parts of the triangles and depicting heaven. I wanted the triangles to be divided into 7 parts, each of the centres forming one of the 7 seals. I added a perimeter that I saw as the spirit of mankind. I embellished it with Alpha above and Christ in heaven, with the crown of Christ and Omega supporting the whole structure from below. The first thing I needed was a thick, stable, well-seasoned panel and some softwood for the surround. I was lucky to find an old door and frame from which to reclaim the material. I clean off any old paint and varnish and then plane these pieces and sand them ready for marking out. After marking, I cut back the wood with chisels and the router to achieve the relief that I want. I cut some sections of olive wood and shaped them on the bandsaw to fit the contours of the perimeter. I then cut steps in the wood, 5 on the outside and 3 on the inside, it being harder to enter heaven than to exit. I glued similarly shaped section in a circle enclosing heaven and swinging the router on a central pivot matched the steps to the adjacent finished beads. Then I offered all the mouldings together and trimmed the required mitres to fit. Before fixing the beads, I cut slots on the lines of the 7 triangles to be able to firmly fix ebony outline sections later. Finally, I glued all the components in place using a strong, hot hide glue. With the ebony triangles completed, it was time to prepare the panel for gesso. I sealed the wood with 2 coats of hot rabbit skin glue, and 2 days later a further tack coat containing a little gesso. A week after that I built up 10 thin coats of gesso. The next thing to decide was the size and shapes of the carvings that I would superimpose on the panel. I wanted 3 carvings. The first, Christ rampant, a ferocious warrior returning to earth for the final battle with his age-old adversary Satan, drawing a sword from his mouth, his wise and cutting words. The second, the traditional concept, the beaten Christ being crucified on the cross. And the third, the eternal Father looking on in despair at what the world did to his Son Jesus, and the vengeful vision of Christ emerging to exact retribution. While the panel was drying, I turned my attentions to the frame, as I particularly wanted to view the finished proportions of the whole piece before going any further. I moulded the wood to mirror the steps of heaven's perimeter, and took special care in the preparation of the corner mitered tenon joints to ensure a really strong structure. All that remained then was to glue up and cramp the prepared pieces together. The next day I cut off the nibs, sandpapered and glue primed it. I also prepared and fitted some screw-in beads to hold the panel in place from the rear. When the frame was dry and stabilised, I followed the rigid gesso regime of measuring and dissolving rabbit skin glue, mixing in gesso, and applying multiple thin coats equally to the surfaces, scraping them all smooth when completely cured. To complete the outline of the whole piece, I shaped a suitable alpha from olive wood, and heavily relieving the back, fitted it in place, fixing it through the frame with a large brass screw. Then I decorated it with inlaid ebony to make it look as important as I thought it should be. The 7 seals at the centres of the triangles were to be raised, so I cut some pieces of old oak into triangular shapes. I made a plasticine mould and cast some small circular buttons from plaster of Paris. When these components were fixed in place, primed and gessoed, I dribbled some gesso sottile, pastiglio, with a cocktail stick, dividing each triangle into 7 pieces. Tinting the top coats of sottile with a little red ochre pigment, the better to see it, I drew in raised flames with a small sable brush. When completely dry, I mixed and applied 5 coats of red bole in preparation for gilding. Returning to the now completely dry carvings, I placed them on the panel and drew around them. Carefully cutting back the gesso, I glued the 3 pieces in place. Some days later, having tooled and scraped the fine detail of the carvings, I gave them a few coats of gesso sottile, blending in the edges to the existing gesso of the panel, which was now structurally complete and ready for decoration. It took some time to draw in the cartoons of the 7 angels, as space in heaven was getting sparse. I wanted them in different threatening poses, and in reducing sizes, making the smaller ones appear further away. The ensuing weeks were spent in gradually building up the form of the angels with gesso sottile, one by one, carving with dental tools, and when dry enough, laying in further coats, manipulating them with sable brushes. As each one became complete to my satisfaction, I laid in coats of red bole in the areas I would gild, with double weight 23.5 carat gold leaf. Beginning work one morning, I realized that I had made the Eternal Father's head too big, and had to take the panel down into the workshop and chisel away most of his hair. It took weeks to slowly build up the gesso repair, a costly error in terms of time and confidence. Whilst gilding some other work, I became dissatisfied with the red bole as being too dark, so I switched to yellow for the remaining thin coats prior to gilding. They dried quickly, and I was able to embark on the enjoyable, if extremely exacting task of laying in the gold leaf. The slightest breath of air scatters the leaf in all directions, so breathing through the side of my mouth, I wetted the surfaces with a weak mixture of glue, distilled water, and a touch of gin, and lifted the pieces in place with a gilder's tip. Burnishing, after testing for correct drying time, I progressed stage by stage until complete. I continued the gilding by laying in some 24-carat triple leaf over the dividing threads of the triangles, the internal supports of the 7 churches, the spirit of mankind, and over the central round seals where it would later become numerals. Next, many thin coats of ground red bull mixture were applied to the outer areas, the dark, the universe, the unknown. When this coating was smooth and dry, I followed up with 2 layers of mixed silver and platinum leaf, and then when that was dry enough to click when wrapped with an agate tool, I burnished it to make it shine. Now it was time for the final piece of woodwork, which was not by mere chance the Omega. I cut and shaped it from a prepared square of ebony and polished the visible areas. Then, centering the letter within the crown, I marked around it with a sharp point and removed the gesso back to wood. The symbolic Omega was then firmly glued in its place. The tempting place to start painting was the largest area, heaven, the blue and white sky surrounding the angels. I prepared egg yolk mixed with pigmented colour and diluted with distilled water. This mixture is termed egg tempera and is applied with sable brushes. Continuing in this way, I laid colour in all the areas I required. The angels, Jesus on the cross, the Holy Father, and Christ, the avenging warrior. The next largest areas I allocated to Jezebel and the serpent, left, and Satan and the same serpent, right. They appear in the process of draining the remaining lifeblood from the spirit of the 7 churches. Each of the 7 seals is divided into 7 parts, with the numeral at its centre. The 6 icons surrounding the numeral represent some of the events described in Revelations relative to the opening of each numbered seal. What I thought would be the most enjoyable part of the job turned out to be the most tedious. Finding it difficult to see the smaller work at all, I had to use a lit magnifier for all the detail. Thousands of strokes using tiny brushes and thin, watery paint. I brushed a few coats of diluted gelatine mixed with titanium white pigment onto the frame, and after a final clean-up and wax polish of the wood, I saw the piece completed.